The phone slipped from her hands as she ran down the marble hallway. Upstairs, the Millionaire CEO gasped for air, clutching his chest, his face draining of color. Moments earlier, she had begged someone, anyone, to listen. But no one did. She was just the cleaner. Now, alarms echoed through the building. People shouted, scattering in panic. But while others froze, she raced toward the danger, heart pounding, mind replaying the symptoms she'd spotted hours ago. She knew exactly what was happening, she'd seen it before, and if she didn't act now, he'd be dead in minutes. The question was, would they finally believe her before it was too late? For Marlene, the mornings always started the same. She'd step off the bus just before sunrise, the city still half asleep, and make her way to the towering glass building that housed people who barely knew her name. She wasn't bitter, cleaning was honest work, and it kept food on the table for her and her grandson. Inside, she moved quietly through polished hallways, her reflection staring back at her in the marble floors she scrubbed each day. The staff passed her without a glance, their conversations about deals and profits sailing over her head like she wasn't there at all. Marlene had learned to stay invisible. It made the job easier. But that morning, something felt different. She noticed the CEO step out of the elevator, his usually confident stride replaced with something slower, heavier. His hand brushed his chest for just a moment before he disappeared into his office. She thought about it all morning, wondering if she should say something. But in a place where her voice had never carried weight, what good would it do? She didn't know it yet, but that small hesitation was about to collide with a moment that would test every instinct she had. Marlene kept working, but her eyes flicked toward the CEO's office more than once. She told herself she was imagining it. People get tired, stressed, but the image of his pale face and that fleeting clutch at his chest wouldn't leave her mind. By mid-morning, she passed him again in the hallway. His skin looked clammy, and there was a faint tremor in his hands as he adjusted his tie. This time, she opened her mouth. "Sir?" she began, her voice tentative. He barely looked at her. Yes, floors look great," he said, brushing past. She stood there for a moment, her jaw tightening. She knew those signs. Years ago, her brother had collapsed from the same symptoms, and the doctor said if someone had acted minutes earlier, he might still be alive. Gathering her courage, she went to the receptionist. "I think Mr. Hastings isn't feeling well. He should get checked." The woman cut her off with a polite but icy smile. "Marlene, I'm sure he's fine. You should get back to your duties." It wasn't just dismissal, it was the look. The look that said you're out of place, you don't belong in this conversation. The hours crawled by. Around noon, she heard a faint commotion upstairs, voices raised, hurried footsteps. She glanced up from polishing the brass railing to see two junior executives clustered outside the CEO's office, whispering. Her gut twisted. Something was wrong. She stepped closer, only to be met with a wall of stairs. One man shifted to block her view. "Can I help you?" he asked, tone sharp. I just wanted to say, I noticed earlier. Look, we're handling it. Go back to work." The words hit her like a slap. She turned away, heat rushing to her cheeks, shame and frustration tangled in her chest. She'd been invisible for so long, but now, when she needed to be heard, she was being pushed back into invisibility. Minutes later, she heard the sound that would snap her into action, a heavy thud from upstairs, followed by shouts. She dropped the cleaning rag and ran. Her footsteps echoed in the stairwell as she reached the landing to find chaos. The CEO sprawled on the floor, gasping, his face ghostly. The executives circled, frozen, pulling out phones, fumbling with panic. "Call an ambulance!" someone yelled, but no one moved to help him. Marlene's mind went cold and clear. She pushed past them, ignoring their startled protests, and knelt beside him. "Sir, stay with me," she urged, checking his breathing. She turned to the nearest man. "You call emergency now. Tell them it's a suspected cardiac episode. And you, get me the first aid kit from the break room." For a second, no one moved. Then, perhaps startled by the authority in her voice, They scrambled into action. She stayed with him, counting compressions in her head, refusing to let fear slow her hands. She could feel every eye on her, the cleaner, the one they barely noticed, now the only thing standing between this man and death. And just as the wail of sirens reached the building, she thought of the irony. It took him collapsing for anyone to finally listen. But what happened after would prove that prejudice doesn't vanish just because you saved someone's life. The paramedics burst through the glass doors, their stretcher rattling across the polished floor. Marlene stepped back only when one of them placed a hand on her shoulder, but she kept her eyes on the CEOs as they loaded him onto the gurney. He was conscious now, barely, his gaze flicking toward her in confusion, like he couldn't quite place where he knew her from. The room was chaos, executives barking orders, phones ringing, voices raised. But as Marlene caught her breath, the whispers started. "Can you believe she touched him like that? What was she even doing in his office? She probably made it worse, trying to play hero." Each word was a knife. They didn't see her as the woman who had just saved their boss. They saw her as the cleaner who stepped out of line. An HR manager approached, tight smile plastered on her face. "Marlene, we'll need you to give a statement, but please understand, you shouldn't have been interfering. Liability issues, you know?" She stared at the woman, disbelief surging. Interfering? If she hadn't acted, he'd be dead. But before she could answer, 2 police officers walked in, for her. One of the executives had told them a suspicious staff member had been in the CEO's office before he collapsed. The words hung in the air like poison. Her hands trembled as one officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, we just need to ask you a few questions." His tone was calm, but she could feel the eyes on her, judging, assuming, deciding her guilt without hearing a word. She explained what she'd seen that morning, the symptoms she recognized, how she tried to warn someone. But the officer's expression didn't change. "Right," he said finally. "Still, we'll need you to come down to the station." "Standard procedure." Her chest tightened. Standard procedure. She knew what that meant for someone who looked like her. She glanced around, searching for a friendly face, for anyone to speak up. Silence. The same people she'd worked alongside for years, cleaning their offices, emptying their trash, making their world shine, stood there, watching her as though she were a threat. Then a voice. Weak, raspy, but commanding. "Stop." The room fell silent as the CEO, pale and barely upright, appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a paramedic. "That woman," he said, pointing at Marlene, "saved my life." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The officers paused, glancing between him and her. The HR manager's face strained of color. But even in that moment, her moment, Marlene saw it. The hesitation in their eyes, the unspoken but. The CEO's word might have stopped the worst from happening, but it didn't erase the fact that the first instinct had been to treat her as a suspect, not a savior. And deep down, she knew, this was the moment her life had changed. Not just because she'd saved someone's life, but because she'd seen the truth of how quickly people's respect could vanish the second they looked at her skin instead of her soul. The CEO survived. Doctors later confirmed that Marlene's quick action had prevented a massive cardiac arrest from turning fatal. In medical terms, she had given him a second chance at life. The company issued a formal thank you. HR handed her a framed certificate with her name printed neatly in gold ink. Cameras flashed, hands shook, polite smiles were exchanged. But Marlene knew the truth. Gratitude didn't erase what happened in those first critical minutes. Because before she was a hero, she was a suspect. In the days that followed, the building buzzed with the story. Some called her brave. Others muttered that she was lucky she didn't make things worse. But what stayed with Marlene wasn't the praise or the skepticism. It was the moment she saw the officers walking toward her, believing she was a threat before knowing her name. She kept working at the same job. The floors still gleamed under her care, the offices still smelled faintly of lemon polish. People smiled at her more now, stopped to say hello. But sometimes she caught the flicker in their eyes, that split-second hesitation, as if they were reminding themselves, Oh right, she's the one who saved him. It was a strange kind of respect, one that felt conditional. Conditional on her proving her worth in a way most people never have to. Conditional on her being more than the stereotype they'd already decided she was. One afternoon, weeks later, the CEO found her in the lobby. He thanked her again, sincerely this time, without the cameras. "I owe you my life," he said. She nodded, then asked him quietly, "Would you have believed me that morning if I wasn't who I am?" He didn't answer. His eyes shifted to the floor, and in that silence she had hers. This wasn't just about saving one man's life. It was about the cost of being ignored, the danger in not listening because of who the message comes from. How many warnings go unheard because the voice isn't dressed in a suit, doesn't sit at the corner office, doesn't match the picture in someone's head of who holds knowledge, who deserves to be believed? Marlene didn't tell the story for glory. She told it because she wanted people to understand that racism doesn't always shout. It whispers in who gets interrupted, who gets dismissed, who gets doubted in the moments that matter most. And maybe that day, she saved more than one life. Maybe someone watching, someone listening, would remember her voice the next time they were tempted to overlook it. Because if her warning had been heard the first time, the sirens might never have been needed. So the question is, how many more people have to go unheard before we start listening the first time?